Chapter 25 of The Man of the House by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 25. At Beth's Suggestion.
There ought to be some way thought out for keeping these wrists in shape after you get them done. Great use in silking them so nice, and patting and smoothing them, when you know they'll be poked into a great box that doesn't fit them, and be all rumpled up dreadfully.
This was Beth talking to herself while she looked over and put the finishing touches on a dozen ladies' gauntlet gloves that she had taken unusual pains in silking. At least she concluded that she was talking to herself. Reuben was in the room and had been for an hour, and Beth had said a good deal during the hour. At first to him, but finding him eager over the arithmetic lesson that was puzzling him, and getting no answer save an absent-minded now and then, which he meant for yes, Beth had tried to keep still. Whether the subject had specially interested him, or whether it was because he had just conquered a troublesome example, I do not know. But as Beth finished her lecture about the gauntlets, he looked up from his slate and said, "What did you say, Beth?"
"Oh," said Beth, "you've got back, have you? I've been talking to you by spells for the last half hour, and I might as well have talked to the lamp."
Reuben laughed, owned that he had been bothered by an example, but had beaten it, and then asked again what she said about boxes.
"Oh," Beth said again, "it was that word that waked you up. Say anything about boxes, and if you are within 100 miles, you will hear. Well, I said that some of you ought to contrive better shaped boxes for these beautiful gauntlet gloves than the ones you stuff them into. I know they must come out looking horrid, and I think it is too bad. Look at these, Reuben. Isn't that orange silk too lovely for anything?"
"That's an idea," said Reuben, taking the gauntlet in hand and looking as though the orange silk was very far from his thoughts, though he stared at it with wide-opened, dreamy eyes. That was really the beginning of it. The arithmetic suffered somewhat after that for days together. The mother, looking on, was a good deal disturbed. She wanted Reuben to be a scholar. His grandfather had been, and she had watched the bringing out of the arithmetic, and heard Reuben's determination to catch up with the rest of the boys so he could join the class by next fall, with great satisfaction. Now the question was, what had taken his attention so completely that for 3 evenings he did not open the arithmetic?
"Never you mind," said Miss Hunter, nodding her head. "The boy has an idea, and is planning to carry it out. I see him busy thinking, even while he is eating his supper. There isn't any mischief brewing as long as he has such clear eyes as those, and prays every evening the way he does. Don't you be afraid."
"You don't think he can do anything wrong?" said Mrs. Stone, but she smiled as she said it. She was very proud of Reuben. Now, what was he about? Well, I suppose you have forgotten all about those 7 pasteboards out of which he meant to make his fortune. But you may be sure he had not. All through the winter, which was now quite gone, he had thought about them more or less, gone often to look at them in the corner of the attic where they were stored, and thought over and cast aside several plans for making something new and wonderful out of them. Nothing suited him. He wanted something different from what had ever been seen, and he could not decide on what it should be. The moment Beth began her argument against the boxes now in use for her favorite gauntlets, he was interested. A thought came into his mind, and grew as the days went by. First experiment did not succeed. In fact, one entire sheet of the 7 was spoiled before anything had come of his idea. Meantime, Beth grew almost discouraged over his stillness and dreaminess.
"It is worse than arithmetic," she told Miss Hunter, "for then I could get him to say a word once in a while. but now he just sits and stares at the sky or the trees and doesn't open his lips." "You wait," said Miss Hunter. "Something will come of it, I know." Miss Hunter believed in Reuben. It was nearly 2 weeks after the new idea had taken root that Reuben came home one evening with a radiant face. He could hardly eat his supper, and made them all laugh by trying to eat his syrup with a fork and stir his milk with a knife. He seized upon the bread dish the moment supper was over, and followed Beth to the cellar for a confidential talk. "Beth," he said, his face aglow with triumph, "I've got it." "Have you?" said Beth, with provoking coolness, as she stooped over the cookie crock. "I hope it is worth having, and that you will give me a piece of it." Reuben laughed gleefully. "I'll do that," he said. "At least, you shall have a piece of the thank you that I feel sure Mr. Barrows will give me. I'm going to tell him that you deserve the largest half of it, for it was you that gave me the idea in the first place." "Reuben," said Beth, seating her lamp on the potato box and herself on an overturned tub, "what do you mean?" "Why, that night, don't you know, when you found fault with the boxes that they pack gauntlets in? I never thought of it before, how awkward they are, but that set me to thinking and planning, until now I've got the nicest kind of a box for them. I made one, a regular beauty, brought it home under my work apron, and hid it in the parlor. I wanted you to see it before anybody else did, and tell me what you thought of it. Not a soul has laid eyes on it. Are there any gauntlets in the house?" "Yes, there are some beauties that I finished just this afternoon. The wrists are lined with dove-colored silk, and they are finished with the most lovely shade of blue silk. If you have a box as pretty as they are, it must be a beauty." "Come, children," called Mrs. Stone. "What in the world keeps you so long in the cellar?" It was not until the dishes were washed and the little kitchen in complete order that Reuben had a chance to show his treasure. Then he and Beth went to the parlor, Beth with a pair of the lovely gauntlets under her arm for a trial. It was a perfect fit, an entirely new idea, a box finished with more care than usual, in green and gold, and looking on the outside like all other boxes. But within, an ingenious piece of pasteboard had been fitted in such a way that it shaped the graceful wrist of the gauntlet exactly, and kept it from being crushed. Beth clapped her hands in delight. "They will be worth more money. I know they will," she said eagerly. "One day I said to Mr. Barrows that it was too bad to crumple them all up in that way, and that there ought to be boxes on purpose for them. But he said that couldn't be done, because they were such a queer shape that no machinery could cut them, and nobody could make them after they were cut. But this is easy enough, I should think, and it doesn't take up a speck more room than the other way. What a queer little twisty piece of pasteboard that is, Reuben. How did you ever get it to fit in as it should?" "I had an awful time with it," admitted Reuben. "For a while I thought I would have to give it up, and I tell you I felt badly. I couldn't get to sleep at night for thinking of it, and one night, don't you believe, I dreamed about it. You see, it wouldn't bend enough without breaking, but one day I hit upon this plan of cutting little niches at regular places, and it worked like a charm. I'll tell you what, Beth, this is the only one I have made, but I want to get a half a dozen made up out of my sheets, you know, and I want them made beautifully, with lovely colored paper, and trimmed elegantly, you know, and I want you to help me about it. I have money enough from what I saved over, you know, that mother let me have for the books and hat, to buy some elegant paper, and I want them to be the handsomest boxes that were ever seen in our shop, and I want you to help me." "Well," said Beth, "I will." After that, Reuben was busier than ever.
Only Beth was in the secret now, and they worked together of evenings in the little kitchen as late as the mother would allow. She looking sober, meantime, over the arithmetic, but trying to take Miss Hunter's advice and wait a bit. At last they were ready for exhibition, the entire half dozen, and very handsome boxes they were. Beth, with her talent for pretty things, and her fondness for learning to do whatever she saw done, by dint of making many visits to Reuben in the box shop, and keeping her bright eyes wide open, was no mean hand at the box business. She worked slowly, of course, but very neatly, and she knew how to choose her colors so as to harmonize them well, which was more than Mr. Barrows' foreman often did. So the boxes were carried in triumph to Mother and Miss Hunter, some very handsomely made gauntlet gloves showing off their beauty in their new houses in a way that they had never been able to do before. But, dear me, I don't know how to tell you how pleased Mr. Barrows was with the new idea. He came over to the little house on purpose to take a more careful look at the boxes and inquire into their management. He questioned and cross-questioned Reuben as to how he did this and managed that, and Beth not only, but the mother and friend, listened, well pleased at Reuben's eager explanations, and thought it not too high praise when Mr. Barrows said at last that it was a complete success, and that 100 of them should be manufactured right away and placed in the sales room on exhibition, and that it was a capital idea, and he believed manufacturers would all be willing to pay a trifle more for the boxes, since their goods would show to so much better advantage. "You certainly deserve a great deal of credit," he said, turning to Reuben, "for thinking out and carrying out this idea." "I didn't do all the thinking," declared Reuben eagerly. "Beth made me think of it in the first place, or I don't suppose it would ever have entered my head." "I?" exclaimed Beth, surprised out of her usual timidity before Mr. Barrows. "Why, Reuben, all I ever did was to grumble because they rumpled up the pretty gauntlets so in the boxes that didn't fit them." "Yes," Reuben said, "and that was exactly what set me thinking about it." Everybody laughed over this, and Mr. Barrows said it would be a good thing if all grumbling could be turned to so good an account. But the most surprising part of the talk was yet to come. Mr. Barrows had talked for some time with Mrs. Stone, then with Miss Hunter, and a little with Miss Beth herself, when he suddenly turned to Reuben with a question. "Well, young man, what are you going to charge me for this invention of yours?" "Why," said Reuben, in great amazement and embarrassment, "nothing, sir, of course." "I'm sure I can't see why, provided you mean to let me have it at all. It is a good and useful thing, and I'm inclined to think will please the manufacturers very much. It isn't mine, though, any more than that jacket you have on is mine, or those new boots I saw you wear the other day. The question is, what will you charge me for the use of it, if I am to have the use of it? Or do you mean to sell it to some of the other manufacturers?" Reuben's face was very red. "It is for you, of course, sir," he said eagerly, "and if it is of any good, I'm as glad as I can be." "But, my boy, I thought those 7 pasteboards were for you to make your fortune with. You won't make it very fast at that rate, I'm afraid." But Reuben, laughing and blushing away up to the roots of his hair, declared that they had begun already to make his fortune, for they had made him feel that maybe he could do things and think of things. "Well," said Mr. Barrows at last, "if you won't sell your brains to me, I'll tell you what we'll do. I'll have some boxes made up in our best style and put on exhibition, and I believe the manufacturers will be delighted with them, and will sell them for $2 on 100 more than the others, and one of those dollars I'll have to pay for the additional trouble of making the boxes in this way, and the other $1 you shall have as a nest egg for that fortune we talked about." Never was there a boy more astonished. It was plain that he had not been working for money, nor had he expected any, and he was very earnest in his explanations. But Mr. Barrows assured him that it was all right, that of course he ought to be paid for his thought, if it proved worth paying for, and the manufacturers would soon decide that. Then he went off into an explanation of how the accounts could be kept, and how the machinery could be set for cutting the ingenious little partitions, and who would be the best person to glue them in, and from this to explanations as to why it would be best for Reuben not to let any of the other boys know about this private understanding between them, and was altogether so businesslike, and yet so kind, talking with him as though he were already a man indeed, as well as the man of that little house, that Reuben's head was well nigh turned with business and pleasure by the time Mr. Barrows went away. As for Beth, she professed not to be surprised at all, but declared that of course Mr. Barrows ought to pay for the idea. Why shouldn't he? It was a good one, and it wasn't his. For her part, she knew it would work. The manufacturers would like it. They couldn't help it. The gloves were all rumpled up now, and they must know it, and she shouldn't wonder if Reuben really would make his fortune out of it yet. There was much laughing and talking, and a great excitement in the little house that night. At last the mother brought them back to everyday work by a very sensible remark. "There's one thing I hope, Reuben, now that you've got this plan well out of your head, and that is that you'll go back to your arithmetic with all your might. If you are going to invent things, or do much of anything else that is worth doing, you'll have to know a great deal that they learn out of books." "That's true," said Reuben, "and I mean to know things, mother, whether I invent things or not." "Yes," said Beth, "and if I am to be the sister of an inventor, I must know things too." So, with much laughing, though it was rather late, they settled themselves to arithmetic, and worked an example that very evening that Reuben called a tough fellow. In thinking of it long afterwards, it seemed strange to Reuben that his great trouble should have followed so hard after this first little success of his, almost as if it were jealous of the victory and meant to make him suffer for it at once. He went to bed that night so happy, so very happy, that he told Beth if she should hear him burst out laughing in the middle of the night because he was so bubbled up with joy that he couldn't keep it in, she need not be surprised. And the very next night when he went to bed, his heart felt as heavy as a lump of lead. End of chapter 25. Chapter 26 of The Man of the House by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 26. What followed it? It was toward the middle of the next forenoon. Work was moving on very briskly in the box factory. The busy season was fairly upon them, and all hands were pushing things. Reuben had not seen Mr. Barrows that morning, but he had seen and heard a good deal that made his cheeks red and his heart beat high with pleasure. The half-dozen handsome boxes were arranged in a very prominent place in the great sales room, and more than half a dozen of the leading manufacturers of the town had dropped in on business and been shown the new invention by the foreman. And every one of them had expressed satisfaction over the plan, and, what was more to the point, every one of them had ordered a few for trial. Reuben, keen-eyed and quick-witted as he was, felt almost sure now that they would succeed. It was great fun to go back and forth on errands and hear the bits of talk, and know himself to be in the secret, and have none of the others know anything about it. He liked it better than he would to have had people know that the thought was his. though Beth was for being indignant over this part of the arrangement, and believed that everybody ought to be told who invented the box. Several times during the morning Reuben wondered where Mr. Barrows was, and why he did not come to talk with the manufacturers. At last he heard with great satisfaction the call to go to the office. Mr. Barrows was at the desk, surrounded by files of papers and blank books. He looked very grave, and Reuben decided at once that something troubled him. Some business matter, perhaps, which had driven all thought of the new boxes from his mind. He seemed to have nothing to say to Reuben, after all. Just raising his eyes for a moment as the boy came in, he dropped them again on the column of figures before him, and Reuben waited. "Have you nothing to say to me, sir?" No, it was not the boy who asked the question, but the man, after Reuben had waited in respectful silence for some minutes. "I?" Reuben was too much astonished to say more. Then he rallied. "Why, yes, sir. There is ever so much to say. 6 of the manufacturers have been in, and Mr. Burnside is there now. They have all ordered boxes, and they said a good many nice things about them. Mr. Anderson said—" A slight movement of impatience from Mr. Barrows stopped his eager tongue. "I am not thinking about the boxes," said that gentleman, "nor do I want to hear anything about them. The question is, what have you to say to me about the horse?" "The horse, sir?" And now Reuben was not only much astonished, but too thoroughly bewildered to say more. What could he possibly have to say about the horse? But Mr. Barrows waited, until at last he stammered forth, "I don't know what you mean, sir. I don't know of anything that I ought to say about Samson." "You don't?" "No, sir." "Well, it is my opinion that you ought to know of a good deal that should be said about him. Reuben, it is worse than idle to waste your time and my patience in this way. I have been waiting all the morning in the hope that I was not so utterly deceived in you as the case appeared, in the hope that you would come to me with some explanation, or at least confession. But I waited in vain. And now, when I send for you, I find nothing but an attempt to deceive me." "Mr. Barrows, I haven't a thing to confess, and I don't know what you mean." Reuben's great earnest eyes looked steadily into Mr. Barrows's face as he said these words, and the gentleman in his turn seemed bewildered. At last he said, "It cannot be, Reuben, after the trust I have put in you, that you would be so entirely false. I must believe that you do not know how much injury you have done. I have to tell you, then, that the poor horse is hopelessly injured, and is suffering greatly. We have great fears that we shall have to kill him to put him out of his misery." Then indeed did Reuben's face change. It grew pale. His voice was eager and full of pain. "Oh, poor Samson! How did it happen? Can't they do something for him? How did you find it out? Mr. Barrows, I heard the foreman tell yesterday of that new man on Main Street, how he cured a horse that was hurt awfully. Couldn't you have him?" "Everything is being done that is possible." Mr. Barrows spoke the words very coldly. "And as to how it happened, I am waiting to have you tell me." The words and the tone recalled to Reuben the fact that, for some reason, Mr. Barrows was displeased with him, and now it flashed over him that he was suspected of having hurt the horse. He was so surprised and grieved that he could hardly speak the words distinctly, yet he poured them forth. "Oh, Mr. Barrows, do you suppose, you can't believe that I would hurt Samson? Why, I love him." "Not intentionally, Reuben. I cannot think that you would. But you see, the mischief is done. Now I want the whole story." "Mr. Barrows, I haven't got any story to tell. I don't know anything at all about how Samson got hurt." Alas for poor Reuben! Mr. Barrows did not believe that this was so. For the last 3 months the boy had been about the horse every day, watered him, fed him, petted him, driven him to the store and the office, driven around the block with him again and again while they waited for his master, the only boy in his employ that the master had allowed to have anything to do with his valuable horse. Since the attempt to steal Samson for a night's ride, which Reuben had spoiled, a padlock with a very peculiar lock had been placed on the barn. To this lock there were 2 keys, one for Mr. Barrows and one for Rupert, the trusted hired man. For nearly a week Rupert had been sick in his bed, and Reuben had taken more care than ever before of the horse, and had been trusted to carry the other key, that he might pay Samson a visit when necessary while Mr. Barrows was absent. This morning the barn had been found locked as usual, but the poor horse was holding up one trembling leg and groaning sadly. Mr. Barrows, thinking it all over, had believed that the temptation to take a horseback ride had been too much for Reuben, and that he had gone in the night, and, getting into trouble, had hurried the horse back to the stable, locked the door, and left him in his misery. This had been a hard thing to forgive, but, as he talked with Reuben, he decided that the boy had not known before that Samson was injured. This was bad enough, but still not so dreadful as the other. Now, if he would but confess it all! But here he stood, boldly denying that he had any knowledge of the trouble. "Reuben," after a moment of solemn silence, "where is the padlock key I allowed you to carry?" "In my pocket, sir, that hangs by my corner in the workroom." "I know it. I took pains to learn that it was there. And mine is in my pocket, and you and I know that only those who have been very carefully taught can turn that lock. Rupert and you and I know how. Rupert is sick in bed. My key is here on my chain, where it has been all the time. The lock is not broken, yet the horse has been out during the night, and has been ruined, and has then been brought back home and locked in alone in his misery. Now, Reuben, will you confess the whole miserable story? I cannot feel that I have acted in a way to make you so terribly afraid to tell me the truth. I have loved you, my boy, since you reminded me of my own boy who is gone. But he was truthful and noble." Not a word said Reuben. If he had suddenly been turned to stone, he could not have stood stiller or been more silent. Mr. Barrows watched him and waited. His face was pale, very pale, and his eyes had the troubled look of one who does not see his way clear. 1, 2, 5 minutes, and they seemed to him afterwards like hours. Then he spoke. "Mr. Barrows, everything is against me. I don't see how you can believe me. I know I have that key safe in my pocket, and I know the lock can't be turned with any other kind of a key, or by people who don't know how. And I can't tell anything about it. Only this: I never took Samson out of his stall. He was as well and happy as could be last night at 8 o'clock, when I locked him in for the night, and I haven't seen him since, and I don't know how he got hurt. And oh, I am so sorry for him. But, Mr. Barrows, everything is against me, and I don't see how you can believe me." Said Mr. Barrows with a disappointed sigh, "You are right, Reuben, I can't." Then began a sad time for Reuben. Samson had to be killed, and that almost broke the boy's heart. But, worse than that, he found no way to prove that he had nothing to do with the trouble. But you should have seen Beth. She was furious. The idea that Mr. Barrows should not believe every word that Reuben said was, to her mind, an insult too deep to be borne. She urged Reuben not to do another hour's work for him, but to tell him to look out for a boy that he thought he could trust. She urged her mother to move at once out of his house and to refuse to have anything more to do with him, and had only a burst of tears in answer to the question, where would they go? As for the mother, she did not help her boy very much. She believed in him, oh yes, indeed. It did not once occur to her to think that he had spoken other than the truth. You see, she had known Reuben so long, and been able to trust him so fully, that the habit was formed. But she fretted, and said some things that were hard to bear, such as this: "It serves you right, Reuben, for meddling with the horse at all. If you had kept away from him, as the other boys do, you wouldn't have got into any trouble. Why doesn't he suspect them?" Then would Reuben try to explain that his employer had given him duties about the horse, trusted him to his care, and that it was as much a part of his work at times to care for Samson as it was to go to the shop. But the mother would answer, "Oh yes, a part of your work. I know that. But if you hadn't always been hanging around the horse, and petting him, and showing yourself so eager and able to take care of him, Mr. Barrows would not have thought of such a thing, and you such a little fellow." Then would Reuben sigh and look utterly discouraged, and the mother would hasten to say, "Not that I blame you. You did it all for the best, I dare say. And if the man had common sense, he would know he could trust you. But it is all very hard. You had such a splendid chance, and I thought he would send you to school." Meantime, Miss Hunter was the cheeriest friend he had. "It'll all come right," she would say, nodding her wise head. "Trust him. He never makes mistakes nor forgets. Just keep telling him all about it as though you knew he would take care of it, and he will." And Reuben would smile and feel his heart warm within him at the remembrance of his powerful friend. Beth was apt to torment him with questions hard to answer, as, for instance, "Reuben, haven't you the least kind of a notion who might have taken the horse?" "What's the use of notions without proofs?" would Reuben answer. "Notions are mean. They make a fellow suspicious." "But, Reuben, I most know you guess who it might be. Somebody did it, of course. I wish he would get awful sick and get afraid and have to confess it." "That's like a story in a book," would Reuben answer, with a little curl of his wiser lip. "Things don't happen like that out of books." But then Miss Hunter had a word to say. "Things don't happen at all, my boy. God looks after them. He can take care of you not only, but of the one who did the mischief, and he'll do it." "But, Miss Hunter, don't you think it is awful mean in Mr. Barrows not to believe Reuben? He never told a lie in his life." "I don't think it is strange that he doesn't believe me," declared Reuben. "You see, it is all against me. I've got the key, and the only key there is besides the one that he carries himself. And I know how to turn the lock, and I was the only one besides Rupert who did. And Rupert was sick in bed, and somebody took the horse out and lamed him, and then put him back there to suffer. I think that was the meanest." But when Reuben went on in this way, trying to clear Mr. Barrows of meanness for not trusting him, Beth's patience gave out entirely, and she was apt to almost get as angry with Reuben as she was with his master. So among them all, Reuben really had a very sad time. Quite a large number of the handsome boxes were being manufactured, and all who saw them were pleased, but Reuben had almost entirely lost his pleasure in them. It seemed very strange to him that Mr. Barrows did not discharge him. Every morning he went to his work wondering whether it would not be his last day in the box shop. The truth was that Mr. Barrows, though he still believed him guilty, was sorry for him. He believed that he had been led away by a great temptation, had been frightened by the sad consequences into telling falsehood after falsehood, but he thought by keeping him in his place and being steadily kind to him, Reuben would grow ashamed of his silence, and get courage to confess the whole. So he waited. And Reuben waited and prayed and wondered how it would all end. In spite of his prompt answer to Beth, "What's the use of having notions?" he had one all the same, and could not get away from the thought that in some way his special torment, Andrew Porter, had to do with the trouble. Not that he could make even a guess how it could have been done. He had never shown Andrew his key, or boasted of it in any way. If he had, that would not have taught the boy how to use it. And if he tried 99 times to unlock it, he would have been as far away from doing it the 100th time as he was the first. Besides, I had the key to the stable myself all the time in my pocket. So he would argue to himself, growing more and more puzzled as he thought it over, and feeling more and more that Mr. Barrows was not to blame in suspecting him. "But then," would the boy continue, "somebody unlocked that barn and took out that horse, dear old fellow, and brought him back again and locked him up, and you see, I know that I didn't do it, and that thing Mr. Barrows doesn't know. So there I have the advantage of him." The days went on, and nothing occurred to help him out of his trouble. Mr. Barrows had questioned and cross-questioned Reuben, and was growing every hour more puzzled and anxious. "I loved the boy almost well enough to give him part of the place of our boy who is gone," he said to his wife. "I meant to do well by him if this thing hadn't come up. I don't understand it." "Papa," would Grace Barrows say, with a firm little set of her lips, "Reuben Watson Stone never did it. Never." And the father would smile and find himself wondering if Grace were not right. But then, in that case, who did? Meantime, the boy Andrew walked the streets as well and strong as ever, though as often as Reuben looked at him, he could not help remembering Beth's words, "I wish he would get awful sick and get afraid and have to confess it." Nothing looked more improbable than that Andrew Porter would get awful sick. This Reuben thought as he overtook him one evening just at the corner, and Andrew turned suddenly and went the other way. As Reuben walked on, he went over again for the 100th time the possible reasons he had for suspecting Andrew. They were very weak ones. He was a mischievous boy, an untruthful boy, and was very fond of horses, and almost equally fond of teasing Reuben Stone. Yet Reuben had to own that he saw no possible way for Andrew to have accomplished this teasing. "If he did it," he told himself with a sigh, "he will keep his secret. He is not the boy to tell of himself. And as for getting sick, there isn't a healthier looking boy in this town." Yet the very next morning there was news. End of chapter 26. Chapter 27, the final chapter of The Man of the House by Pansy. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Chapter 27, Justice at Last. The boys were full of it when he reached the shop. Had Reuben heard? Did he know about the great fire? Surely he must have heard the fire bells. Yes, Reuben had heard the fire bells, but his mother had objected to his going to the fire, so he had stayed in. "Huh," said one of the boys. "I guess Andrew Porter wishes his mother had objected, and he had paid any attention to her." Reuben turned quickly. "Why, what about him?" "Why, he went to the fire. It was the machine shop, you know, burned to the ground. Ever so much money lost. Andrew climbed up somewhere. He's always climbing. And the wall gave way, or the stairs or something, and he fell hundreds of feet, some say. Anyhow, they picked him up for dead, but he isn't dead. The doctor just came from there, and I heard him tell Mr. Stewart that the boy was breathing, but that was about all." As Reuben stood silent for a full minute before turning to his work to think over this wonderful and terrible news, there came to him a curious, pained feeling that somehow he was to blame. Had he really wished Andrew to get awful sick? Oh, but he had not wanted him to die. Suppose he should die without ever speaking another word? And suppose he had done it? All day Reuben's heart was heavier than ever, but he prayed a great many times that day for the life of Andrew. The boy did not die. As the days passed, it was found that his life was not in present danger. But with this news came some that seemed to the boys almost as sad as death itself. There was a hush in the shop all the morning after Clark Potter gave the news. He himself had heard the doctor that very morning tell Andrew's uncle from Eastport that the fall had hurt his spine in some way. Clark had not understood how, only this he knew, that the doctor had said positively that the boy would never take another step. It was 3 days afterwards that Reuben decided to go and see Andrew Porter. It was not because he had any hope of hearing news from him concerning poor Samson. In fact, he did not think of Samson when he decided to go. It was because Clark said he heard that Andrew was awful lonesome, and complained that the boys did not come to see him. I really have not time to tell you much about the next 3 weeks, only in a general way. Reuben carried out his resolve and went that very evening to ask after Andrew, and found him sick and suffering. His mother, who had had orders to let "every fellow in who looked like a boy," took Reuben to his room without warning. A very short call he made, but he felt so sorry for Andrew that on the next day he went again, and again, and at last it grew to be a settled thing that not a day would pass without his spending all the time he could get with Andrew. The books suffered a little. He learned a lesson every night, but it was shorter than it used to be, and his mother wondered if he were going to learn to nurse sick folks instead of being a scholar. And Beth asked many questions as to why he had grown fond of "that Porter boy all of a sudden." Reuben owned that he was not fond of him, but that few of the boys came to see him. He seemed not to have many friends, and he was so lonesome. "He is getting used to me now, and likes to have me come. At first he did not seem to want me." This was all the explanation Reuben had, and Beth tossed her head and thought it was very queer. As for Mr. Barrows, as the days passed and Reuben was faithful to his work and respectful, yet came no nearer to that confession for which the gentleman longed, he told himself that he did not know what to think. How could he trust a boy, and do for a boy as he had meant to for him, who had deceived him? How could the trouble have happened in any other way than through him? Yet, on the other hand, how could a boy who was so faithful in all other things have so dreadfully deceived him once? Mr. Barrows was in almost as much trouble as the rest of them. Meantime, what Andrew thought as he lay day after day in his bed, much of the time alone, he kept to himself. It was a lovely summer evening. The windows of Andrews's room were both thrown wide open, and the bed on which he lay was wheeled as near to them as it could be got, and he lay looking out on the lovely fields, green and quiet, thinking perhaps what a strange, sad thing it was that he should never scamper over them again, for his face was very sober. Reuben, book in hand, waited to go on with the story which he was reading to him, but he put out his hand and motioned the book away. "No, I want to talk. That is, I've got to talk. I've made up my mind. It has taken me weeks to do it, and I never thought I should. And I suppose I might have waited to hear the last of the story, for you won't want to read it to me when I'm done my talk, but I'm going to tell it right here this minute." "All right," said Reuben, "talk away." "But you won't say much more to me in that good-natured way, old fellow, when you've heard my talk. I've got something awful to tell you. Reuben, it was I that took Samson out that night and brought him back again." "I thought as much," said Reuben, his voice very quiet and matter of course. He had not thought over this whole thing for weeks without learning to keep his face quiet when there was need. "You did?" In spite of the poor back, there was a little start from the boy on the bed that made a quiver of pain shoot all through him. "Yes, I did. Do be careful, Andrew. Don't make the least bit of a move again. What will the doctor say if you get up a fever? I think I better read now." "What made you think it was I?" "Oh, I don't know. I just kind of felt maybe it was. Somebody had to do it, you see, and I knew I didn't." "But how did I get in?" "That's more than I know or can guess. And it is what made the whole thing seem foolish. Only, you see, somebody got in, and it might as well have been you as anybody. Now, shall I read?" "No, I'm going to tell you all about it. I didn't mean any harm to you, Reuben, not a bit. I began to like you a little before this. I guess I kind of liked you all the time. I didn't mean to do any harm to anybody. I thought he was dreadful afraid of his old horse, and I knew I could ride horseback, and I thought he considered himself so smart about that key that I just longed to try my hand with it. I most knew it was like the locks Uncle James makes. He's my uncle up in Eastport. He makes all kinds of locks, and he had one real queer that I learned how to manage. I thought this was like it, and it was, oh, enough like it for me to catch the trick when I saw Rupert locking the barn one day. Well, I didn't mean to steal a key, you know, but he left his right on the desk that afternoon." "Who did?" "Mr. Barrows himself. He wears it on that chain, you know, and while I was waiting for him to read the note I brought, he looked at his watch, and the chain got caught somehow, and he worked at it a minute. Then he unscrewed the chain and slipped off the keys and laid them down on the desk. Then that fellow tumbled through the elevator hole, you know, and yelled, and Mr. Barrows thought he was hurt and ran, and I just picked up the key and ran too." "But how did you get it back on the chain?" said Reuben in utter bewilderment. "That was easy enough. I didn't know how to do it. I thought I should have to lose the key. I wish now I had done it, and then he would have thought some fellow found it and broke in, and wouldn't have blamed you. I never thought of his being such a mooly as to think you did it. I didn't, honest, Reuben." "Never mind. What did you do?" "Why, I went there after milk, and Mr. Barrows was dressing. He had been up in Rupert's room taking care of him, and there lay his watch on the table, and his cuff buttons, and all his fixings. I just slipped the key on the chain in a twinkling, and went away happy. I thought there wouldn't be any trouble to anybody." "Then you didn't know Samson was hurt?" "Not a bit of it. I knew he stumbled and got his foot in that mean hole in the crosswalk and limped a little, but that was when we were just home, and I hustled him into the barn and thought he would be all right in the morning, but it turned out just awful." "Oh," said Reuben, "I'm so glad." "Glad of what?" "Why, that you didn't know how poor Samson was hurt. It did seem too awful in anybody to leave him to suffer." "Well, I didn't think about his being hurt much of any. I was cut up awfully when I heard the news next day. Then, next thing I heard, he thought it was you. He might have known better than that, seems to me. I'd have known it with my eyes shut, as many times as he has held you up to me for a pattern, too." Andrew's voice was full of contempt. "I'll tell you what I did," he went on after a moment. "I watched to see if he would discharge you, then I meant to own up, whatever it cost. But when things went on just as usual, I felt a little better." "Oh," said Reuben. It was every word he said. It all flashed over him, the folly of trying to make a boy like Andrew Porter understand what he had suffered, and what his mother and Beth had suffered in bearing false blame. There was more talk, a great deal of it. For now that Andrew's lips were open, he seemed to find comfort in telling all the particulars of those weeks. He told how beat he was to think that Reuben should have been the first boy to call on him, and the only one to come to him day after day, and how he had learned to watch for his coming, and how at last, when he made up his mind that he must tell the whole story or he should die, the worst was to think of not seeing him there any more. "I shall come all the same," said Reuben quietly. "But now I want to ask you one question more. When do you intend to tell Mr. Barrows?" "I?" said Andrew, and the dark red blood rolled into his face. "Why, you can tell him all about it. I'll take the consequences. They can't be very dreadful here on my back. Father would pay for the horse fast enough if he had anything to pay with, but he hasn't, and Mr. Barrows knows it." "No," said Reuben firmly, "you're the one to tell." And to that he held, spite of Andrew's half-tearful arguments. It would be better, a great deal better, both for himself and for Andrew, that the confession should come from him. "And until you tell it," he said, "I will keep still. I have done it so long, and I can keep on." At last Andrew owned that it would be the best, but that he was sure he never could, but that if Reuben would wait, some day he would try, he could not tell when. And truly it seemed to Reuben as the days passed that Andrew was very long in keeping his promise. He did not desert him. The readings went on, and the tender care and kindness, and because of the fever and delirium that followed this first talk, he did not hurry him, or indeed say a word more than his wistful eyes said every day. But all the time he could not help wishing and wishing that Andrew would get courage to do right. He could not bring himself to be willing to tell the story, for he feared Mr. Barrows and others might think that his only object in going to see Andrew in his trouble was to threaten the facts out of him. One night he knew as soon as he turned the corner that led to the little house and saw Beth standing at the gate, that something had happened. Sure enough, she rushed toward him.
"Oh, Reuben, such news! You can't think. Don't you believe that Andrew Porter did it all? And he has had Mr. Barrows there and told all about it, and how good you were and all. And Mr. Barrows has been here, and he cried and said he should never forgive himself for thinking hard of you. And I'm sure I don't believe I can ever forgive him. But he was so nice, Reuben, you can't think. And he wants you to go to school all the time, and he is willing to send you to college, and, oh dear, it is such a splendid long story. Reuben, aren't you awfully astonished?"
"No," said Reuben, his eyes shining. "Not much. You see, I knew the most of it before." Then it was Beth's turn to open her eyes, and she stormed him with questions and overwhelmed him with exclamations for the next half hour. How could he possibly have kept still all those weeks, thinking that Andrew Porter was the boy? Why didn't he run straight home and tell her the minute Andrew confessed it? What was the use in being thought so meanly of a minute longer than was necessary? After much careful explaining, Reuben succeeded in making his eager sister understand something about the feelings that had kept him patient and quiet all these weeks. "You see," he said, as a finish to the story, "I could afford to wait, because I knew it would all come out right. I didn't see how, but then I was sure of it, Because I'm a soldier, and my captain is bound to take care of me and see me safe through everything, because he has promised. And it is likely I shouldn't trust him when I've enlisted to fight under his flag forever. Oh, Beth, if you only were a soldier too." This silenced Beth. I did mean to stop right here and not try to tell you anything more about Reuben Watson Stone, though, as you may imagine, there is plenty to tell. But I do feel as though I must tell you about one thing, because it seems to fit in so far back in the story. Not a week after all these strange things had happened to Reuben, just as he was starting for the shop one morning, a little red and white cow came trotting up the street, a boy guiding her, and a smiling-faced old lady on the sidewalk moved towards Reuben. "How do you do?" she said heartily, as she caught a glimpse of him. "I was in hopes I'd find you in. You remember me, don't you? You found my ticket on the cars, you know, and helped me to the stage afterwards. Oh, I never forgot it, nor your nice, honest face. I've kept an eye on you ever since, though, what with sickness in my son's family, and then being sick myself, I haven't got around before. I heard of your trouble, and I heard of your getting out of it. I knew you would, my boy. The Lord takes care of his own, and I knew you was one of his own. I know a good many things about you. Look here." And she stepped closer to him and sank her voice to a whisper. "You didn't know Spunk's master had anything to do with me, now did you? It is queer, but I'm his grandmother, and I've heard about midnight rides and saloons and all that. You did better work that time than you knew of. My grandson hasn't forgot it, can't forget it. He is the man of the house himself, you see, all the son his mother has, and he didn't like the thought of the contrast there would be between you one of these days if he kept on and you kept on, and he has turned square around. Well, I oughtn't to keep you away from your work, my man, so if you will just look after Dorcas here and tell the boy where you would like to have her put, I'll trot on. Why, yes, of course she is yours. A man with a family to support needs a cow, and she is the nicest critter ever was, and gives cream most instead of milk." Now, I am sure there is no use in trying to describe to you Reuben's astonishment. Isn't it a good place to stop? And yet there came to him before that day closed what he called the best news he had ever had in his life. It was Beth, curling in a little heap on the sofa beside him, who brought it. What do you think it was? Why, that at last she had really decided to wear the colors of his captain and fight under his flag. Among the pleasant words that she spoke to him that night were the ones that told him she had been led to think carefully about it all from seeing how well he bore the trouble that had come to him. Before that, she was getting to have a feeling that it was easy enough for Reuben to be good. Everybody praised him and trusted him, and he did almost exactly as he liked, and there wasn't anything for him to be cross about. But afterwards, when she found herself so cross with Mr. Barrows, and so angry at that wicked somebody who brought all this trouble on him, and found Reuben so patient and so unwilling to have Mr. Barrows blamed, and so cheerful all the time, she began to see that something had made him very different. It was quite dusk when they had their happy talk. Reuben had been to pay a visit to the new Samson who lived in the barn, and who already knew him and liked him well. He had fed Dorcas her evening meal, and drank a glass full of her rich, creamy milk, and had tucked her away for the night. All the day's duties were done. Just then the parlor door opened, and Mother came, bringing a lamp, behind her Miss Hunter looking twice glad, for Beth had given her the good news. "Come, Reuben," said his mother, "let us have prayers now. It is after 8 o'clock. The evenings are growing very short." So they all knelt down, and the man of the house, with a full heart, thanked God for all his benefits. End of chapter 27. End of The Man of the House by Pansy. Thanks for listening.